The truth doesn't always disappear, sometimes it's locked away. Most people imagine history as a finished story. Something happens. It gets reported. Documents are filed. The truth comes out. But history is not always written to reveal. Sometimes it is written to protect. Protect the government. Protect the intelligence agency. Protect the military reputation. Protect an international alliance. Protect public order. Or protect a lie that became too expensive to endure. And when that happens, the truth does not simply vanish. It gets buried in classified files, redacted reports, missing pages, contradictory testimonies, witnesses who misremember, officials who can neither confirm nor deny, and archives that open just enough to prove one terrifying idea. Sometimes governments really do hide things. Not every secret is a conspiracy. Not every rumor is real. Not every theory survives evidence. But once enough real cover-ups are exposed, something changes in the public mind. People stop asking, would a government hide something like this? And start asking, how many times have they already done it? This is Forbidden Files, Events Governments Hid, a documentary series about the moments history didn't disappear by accident, but was sealed, altered, denied, delayed, or quietly buried by the people in power. And in part 1, we begin with the most dangerous truth of all. Governments do not need to erase reality. They only need to control the file. Why governments hide things. Before you look at any case, you have to understand the logic. Because governments rarely describe secrecy as deception. They describe it as necessity, national security, public safety, operational confidentiality, diplomatic sensitivity, strategic stability, and to be fair, some secrecy is real and justified. States deal with military plans, intelligence operations, negotiations, and active threats. No serious country reveals everything in real time. But secrecy becomes dangerous when it stops protecting the public and starts protecting the institution from the public. That is the line. The moment a file is hidden not because disclosure would create danger, but because disclosure would create accountability, secrecy becomes a shield against truth. And once that happens, almost anything can be buried under the language of necessity. A mistake, an illegal operation, a covert experiment, a politically inconvenient event, civilian casualties, surveillance abuses, a false justification for war, an incident too embarrassing to admit. This is why Forbidden File stories refuse to die, because even without proving every rumor, history has already shown that the mechanism is real. Governments can hide. Governments do hide. And sometimes they hide not for days or weeks, but for decades. To M culture when the file finally opened. If you want one example that permanently changed how people think about secret government programs, start here. MK Ultra. For years, it sounded like the kind of story people would dismiss as paranoid fantasy. A secret intelligence program exploring mind control, psychological manipulation, drugs, and methods of altering human behavior. It sounded too dark, too cinematic, too convenient for conspiracy culture. Until documents and investigations proved that something very real had existed. The CIA did run programs under the MK Ultra umbrella. Research did involve methods meant to explore control, interrogation, psychological breakdown, and mind influence. Drugs such as LSD became part of that landscape. Some people were subjected to things they did not fully understand. Some were not meaningfully consenting at all. And suddenly the public learned something it could not unlearn. A government had explored methods that sounded like dystopian fiction, not in theory, but in reality. That matters far beyond MK Ultra itself, because once one impossible program becomes real, it changes how all other rumors are heard. The public stops treating official denial as the end of the story, and starts treating denial as part of the story. That is the long shadow of every exposed cover-up. It doesn't only reveal one secret, it weakens trust in the entire system of dismissal. And this is where conspiracy thinking becomes complicated. Because once governments prove they are capable of hiding dark operations, people become more willing to believe other hidden operations exist too. Some of those beliefs will be wrong, but they are born from a real wound. Pre-Operation Northwoods is the plan that sounds fake until you read it. Some files are disturbing not because they describe what happened, but because they describe what powerful people were willing to consider. One of the most famous examples is Operation Northwoods. This was not a rumor invented decades later. It was a real proposal from the early 1960s associated with U.S. military planning during tensions with Cuba. The plan involved extreme ideas-staged incidents, deceptive operations, manufactured justifications that could be used to create support for military action. Read that slowly. A documented proposal existed in which deception against public perception was part of strategic thinking. Now, Northwoods was not carried out as proposed. That distinction matters, but the psychological impact of its existence is enormous, because it proves something critical. You do not need to show that every shocking theory is true. You only need to show that people inside powerful systems are capable of thinking in those terms. And once that threshold is crossed, public innocence dies. Northwoods became one of those files that permanently altered the emotional relationship between citizens and state power, because it asked a horrifying question. If ideas like this were discussed on paper, what else has been discussed in rooms that never opened? That is the energy behind forbidden file culture. Not just they did this, but if they were willing to imagine this, what were they willing to hide? For the Tuskegee effect, when cover-up creates generational damage. Not every hidden government-linked scandal involves covert operations or military plans. Sometimes the secret is slower, administrative, medical, bureaucratic, and in some ways those are worse, because they reveal not a dramatic hidden operation, but a system that let harm continue quietly for years. The Tuskegee syphilis study became one of the most infamous examples of state-linked betrayal in American history. For decades, black men were observed under false pretenses while proper treatment was withheld, even after penicillin became a known standard therapy. The scandal exploded publicly only after exposure and outrage, but its legacy is bigger than the event itself. Tuskegee taught generations a brutal lesson. Official institutions can smile, document, promise care, and still hide what they are doing. That kind of betrayal doesn't end when the file opens. It passes through families, communities, and history. It reshapes trust in medicine, trust in government, trust in official messaging, and that is one of the most important themes in this entire series. A hidden file is not only about secrecy, it is about what secrecy does to the future. Because when truth is delayed long enough, the damage continues after the paperwork is exposed. 5 Roswell, when a cover story changes too fast. Now we enter the territory where government secrecy and conspiracy culture collide hardest. Roswell. In 1947, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. Initial public statements suggested recovery of a flying disc. Then the story changed. The explanation shifted. Weather balloon. Misunderstanding. Nothing extraordinary. Over the decades, Roswell became one of the most iconic secrecy stories in the world. Was it extraterrestrial? Experimental technology? A classified surveillance project? A public confusion event amplified by the Cold War? Different theories competed, and they still do. But here is what matters most for your documentary tone. Roswell became immortal because of inconsistency. Governments can survive a secret. What makes the public obsessive is a changing explanation. When this story shifts too fast, too sharply, or too often, people don't feel reassured. They feel managed. And once the public believes it is being managed, every future statement becomes weaker. That is why Roswell is bigger than aliens. Roswell is about credibility, because even if the wildest theory is not proven, the behavior around the event taught people a lesson that never disappeared. When officials panic and revise the story, they create the conspiracy themselves. 6. The missing file problem. One of the strangest patterns in hidden state history is how often the most important records are incomplete. Pages missing. Sections redacted. Boxes misplaced. Audio erased. Records destroyed under routine procedure. Witnesses dead. Names blacked out. Dates blurred. Sometimes that happens for mundane reasons. Archives are messy. Bureaucracies lose things. States produce mountains of paper. But when the missing pieces always seem to appear around the most sensitive events, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Because the public understands something instinctively, random loss exists. Strategic loss exists too. And once redaction becomes part of a story, it creates a unique kind of suspense. A black bar over text doesn't calm people. It electrifies them. Because a censored line is proof that someone decided the public should not see it. Not that nothing is there, but that something is. That is why forbidden files feel so powerful in the imagination. They are not empty mysteries. They are mysteries with fingerprints on them. 7. Why people believe the worst. Critics often ask, why do people jump to the darkest conclusion? The answer is simple. Because history trained them to. When governments lie about wars, secret programs, experiments, surveillance, or covert actions, people do not forget the emotional lesson. They learn that official calm can hide chaos. That patriotic language can hide abuse. That nothing unusual happened can mean something happened and we need time. Now, this does not mean every theory is true. It does not mean every secret file contains a monstrous revelation, but it does explain why the public mind becomes primed for hidden truth narratives. Real cover-ups fertilize unreal ones. That's the paradox. The more genuine secrecy exists, the easier it becomes for rumor to spread into places where evidence is weak. So the challenge of a series like this is not to treat every theory as fact. It is to show something more intelligent and more unsettling, that even when the theory is exaggerated, the atmosphere that created it may be historically justified. Once the file closes, the story changes. In part 1, we looked at the machinery behind hidden history. We saw that governments do not hide things only through dramatic operations, but through classification, delay, denial, changing explanations, missing records, and strategic silence. We saw how MKUltra permanently damaged public trust by proving that secret programs could be darker than fiction. We saw how Operation Northwoods revealed the kind of thinking powerful systems were capable of. We saw how Tuskegee proved institutional betrayal could last for decades. And we saw how Roswell became a symbol not only of mystery, but of official inconsistency. But this is only the beginning, because in part 2, we go deeper into the files that turn secrecy into legend. The incidents, covert programs, intelligent shadows, and unexplained events that still make people ask where the history was managed from behind the curtain. Because once you realize governments really do hide things, the next question becomes unavoidable. How much of what we call conspiracy started as a classified memo no one was supposed to read? Part 2. Some secrets are hidden, others are managed. By the time a file becomes public, the truth inside it has usually already changed. Not always because the facts changed, but because the context did. Witnesses disappeared. Memories faded. Officials retired. Records were redacted. Narratives hardened. The public moved on. And that is one of the most powerful tricks governments ever learned. You do not always have to erase an event. Sometimes you only need to delay it long enough. Delay the documents. Delay the investigation. Delay the admission. Delay the accountability. Because by the time the file opens, the world that could have reacted properly is already gone. In part 1, we explored the machinery of hidden history, classification, denial, missing records, changing stories, and the way real cover-ups create the conditions for conspiracy thinking. In part 2, we move deeper into the territory where secrecy becomes legend. Incidents that remain controversial, programs that were hidden in plain sight, and the strange overlap between intelligence, propaganda, surveillance, and unexplained events. This is where the question gets darker. Not did governments hide things? We already know they did. The real question is, how many events that still look mysterious today only look mysterious because someone made sure they stayed that way? One Operation Paperclip, when the secret wasn't whether IT happened, but how much was hidden. Some government secrets are disturbing not because they are fictional, but because they are real enough to force a moral compromise into history. Operation Paperclip is one of those cases. After World War I and II, the United States brought German scientists, engineers, and technical personnel into American programs. The justification was clear, the Cold War was beginning, and knowledge had become strategic currency. Rockets, weapons, aerospace, advanced science. The logic of state power was simple. If these minds are useful, we take them before someone else does. But the moral cost was harder to explain, because this wasn't just a transfer of expertise. It involved men connected to a regime whose crimes had already stained the century. And that is what gives Paperclip its forbidden file energy. Not the fact that governments recruit talent. That happens constantly. But the fact that strategic value can become strong enough to blow morality. The story people tell themselves is that democratic states defend moral order. Paperclip revealed something colder. In moments of geopolitical fear, states will often protect advantage first and ethics later. The secrecy around such programs matters because it teaches the public a lesson no official ever wants to say out loud. The government can condemn one evil in public, while quietly absorbing useful parts of it in private. And once people learn that, they begin looking at every official moral statement with new suspicion. Because if a state can write the biographies of scientists for strategic reasons, what else can it sanitize? To Project Blue Book investigation or containment. If you want one case where government secrecy, public obsession, and the psychology of control collide perfectly, look at Project Blue Book. Officially, Blue Book was presented as an effort to investigate UFO reports. And on paper, that sounds reassuring. People see strange things. The government studies the reports. Professionals classify what they can. Mystery becomes order. But the reason Blue Book still haunts the public imagination is not just what it investigated. It's what many people believe it actually did. To skeptics, Blue Book was mostly a bureaucratic process that explained conventional cases and failed to find evidence of extraterrestrial activity. To believers, Blue Book became something else entirely. A filtering system. A perception management program. A way to reduce, contain, dismiss, and normalize public sightings without revealing what was really known behind closed doors. That distinction matters. Because once an investigation is seen as performative rather than honest, its existence stops building trust and starts destroying it. And that is the danger of state-managed mystery. If the public thinks the state is not investigating to understand but investigating to control the narrative, then every official conclusion feels pre-written. This is why Blue Book remains bigger than UFO. It represents a deeper fear, that when governments study disturbing events, they may not be asking, what is true? They may be asking, what is safe to tell people? And if that's the real question behind the file, then the file is no longer neutral evidence. It becomes part of the concealment. 3 Cointopro, the file that proved paranoia can be justified. There is a phrase people use to dismiss uncomfortable suspicion. It sounds paranoid, but history has a way of humiliating that phrase, because sometimes paranoia is not irrational. Sometimes it is simply premature. That is one reason Cointopro matters so much. The FBI counterintelligence program targeted political organizations and activists inside the United States, using surveillance, infiltration, disruption, disinformation, and psychological pressure. This was not fantasy. This was not rumor. It was a real state program aimed not merely at observing, but at destabilizing people and movements. Read that carefully. A government did not just wash dissent. It actively manipulated it. And the emotional consequence of that discovery is enormous. Because once a government is proven willing to infiltrate, provoke, fracture, mislead, and psychologically pressure its own internal opposition, a new possibility enters public consciousness. That some chaos is not organic. That some scandal, some division, some breakdown, some conflict may have invisible hands inside it. That does not mean every fractured movement was secretly controlled. But it does mean the public can never again dismiss the possibility out of hand. That is what real forbidden files do. They widen the range of what people consider plausible. Cointopro matters not only because of what it did. It matters because it permanently changed the answer to the question. Would they really do that? Yes. Sometimes they would. For mass surveillance of the secret everyone suspected until IT was proven. Before large-scale surveillance programs were exposed in detail, many people assumed such fears were exaggerated. Too paranoid. Too dystopian. Too logistically extreme. Surely not that much monitoring. Surely not that broad. Surely not without public consent. Then, over time, disclosures revealed a reality more invasive than many ordinary citizens had imagined. And once again, the lesson repeated itself. The government does not always deny because the fear is absurd. Sometimes it denies because the fear is accurate ahead of schedule. This category of hidden history is especially important because surveillance doesn't need a dramatic event to damage trust. It changes the emotional environment itself. People speak differently when they think they are watched, organize differently, search differently, risk differently. That means secrecy around surveillance does not merely hide a program. It reshapes behavior before the public fully understands what is happening. In that sense, surveillance secrecy is one of the purest forms of forbidden file power. The file stays closed, but the effect escapes into everyday life, and by the time the public learns the scale of it, the system is already normalized. That is the real genius of invisible governance. Not secrecy forever, secrecy long enough. Try the Gulf of Tonkin when the file doesn't just hide the event, it justifies the war. Some hidden events matter because they damage trust. Others matter because they alter history itself. The Gulf of Tonkin is one of those cases. In 1964, reported attacks involving US naval forces became central to the justification for escalation in Vietnam. At the time, the public and Congress were given a version of events framed with urgency and certainty. But over time, what really happened became far more contested, complicated, and controversial. And that is where the story enters forbidden file territory, because the deeper issue is not only whether confusion existed in the moment, it is whether uncertainty, ambiguity, and questionable evidence were transformed into political certainty because certainty was useful. That possibility is devastating, because it suggests a state can move from fog to force without waiting for full truth. And once that happens, a document is no longer just a record of history. It becomes a weapon that creates history. That is why these files matter so much. Not because governments hide facts in the abstract, but because hidden or distorted facts can justify deaths, invasions, occupations, and generations of consequences. A forbidden file is not always a secret tucked away in the dark. Sometimes it is the missing piece behind a public decision that changed the world. 6. The National Security Shield. There may be no phrase more powerful in hidden state history than this one. National security. It ends questions, delays scrutiny, builds legal walls, creates moral cover. And to be clear, national security can be real. There are operations, technologies, sources, alliances, and risks that genuinely cannot be exposed carelessly. But the phrase becomes dangerous when it is used too broadly, because it can conceal two very different things at once. Something that must be protected from enemies, and something that must be protected from embarrassment. The public rarely gets to see the distinction. That is what makes national security such a perfect shield. It can hide a covert asset, yes, but it can also hide incompetence, legality, abuse, failed operations, unauthorized programs, diplomatic lies. And once the phrase is invoked, the public is often expected to stop asking. That expectation is exactly what forbidden file culture rejects. Because people have learned the hard way that the same wall used to guard legitimate secrets can also guard institutional guilt. So every time a case disappears behind national security language, the suspicion grows. Is this being hidden because it protects us, or because it protects them? That question may never fully go away. 7. When the document isn't enough. One of the strangest things about hidden state history is that even when documents finally emerge, they do not always settle anything. Sometimes they deepen the mystery, because a release file can do 3 things at once. Confirm that something hidden was real, reveal that key sections are still missing, proof that the original public story was incomplete or misleading. That creates a unique psychological effect. File opens, but closure does not come. Instead, the public sees proof of concealment without receiving the full concealed truth. That is why some cases never die. Not because there is no evidence, but because there is evidence of interruption, a torn trail, a sense of line, a reference memo that isn't included, a witness name hidden, a time gap, a contradiction. And once the public notices the interruption, imagination rushes in. That is where legend feeds itself. not from pure emptiness, but from official incompleteness. In other words, the government does not have to create the theory directly. It only has to release the truth in fragments. The fragments will do the rest. 8 Why Forbidden Files Redacted. There is a reason people become obsessed with hidden files, classified memos, redacted reports, and buried events. Because they offer something ordinary history often does not. A visible struggle between appearance and reality. A forbidden file is not just information. It is proof that history had an underside. That behind the press release was another version. Behind the speech, another motive. Behind the official timeline, another sequence of decisions. That feeling is addictive because it turns the viewer into a decoder. Not a passive consumer of history, but an investigator. And once people experience that shift, they never fully return to innocent. They start reading headlines differently, listening to officials differently, interpreting sudden consensus differently. This does not automatically make them correct, but it does change the mental relationship forever. The state says, trust the official story. The forbidden file whispers, you already know there was another one. The secret is sometimes the system itself. In part 2, we went deeper into the forbidden architecture of state power. We saw how Operation Paperclip revealed that strategic usefulness can override moral clarity. We saw how Project Blue Book became, for many, not just an investigation, but a symbol of narrative management. We saw how COINTELPRO proved that paranoia can become history when the file finally opens. We saw how surveillance secrecy reshaped public life before the public fully understood it. And we saw how events like the Gulf of Tonkin suggest that uncertainty can be transformed into policy when power needs certainty more than truth. But part 3 is where the story closes in, because in the final chapter, we leave specific files behind for a larger question. What happens to a society when it learns that secrecy is not the exception, but one of the normal tools of governance? And once people believe that, what is left between suspicion and trust? Part 3, last part. The scariest secret is not the file, it's the pattern. By now, the question is no longer whether governments hide things. They do. History has already answered that. The real question is more dangerous. How often was the truth delayed, filtered, classified, redacted, reworded, or buried under language designed to make the public stop asking? Because once you move past one scandal, one file, one secret program, you begin to notice something far more unsettling than any individual case. A pattern. A pattern where secrecy is not an emergency measure, but a governing habit. A pattern where the official story arrives first. The contradictions arrive later, and the truth, if it arrives at all, comes when the people responsible are retired, dead, protected, or impossible to hold accountable. That is the real power of forbidden files. They do not just expose hidden events. They expose the time machine of secrecy. Delay the truth long enough, and history becomes easier to control. One, the perfect cover-up doesn't hide everything. Most people imagine a cover-up as total silence. Missing documents. No witnesses. Nothing left behind. But that is rarely how real concealment works. The most effective cover-up does not erase the whole story. It leaves just enough behind to confuse it. A partial memo. A change explanation. A witness who contradicts the official line. A file with redactions in the exact places that matter. A statement that technically says nothing false but carefully avoids the truth. That's why so many hidden state stories feel unresolved. Because they are. Not by accident, but by design. Total deletion creates suspicion. Controlled fragments create debate. And debate is useful. Because a population arguing endlessly over incomplete information is easier to manage than a population facing a clean, undeniable truth. This is why some of the most powerful secrets are not hidden in darkness. They are hidden in noise. 2. Why trust breaks faster than IT returns. A government can spend decades building legitimacy, but one exposure can outlive an entire generation. That is the hidden cost of forbidden files. Not just what they reveal, but what they destroy. Trust in institutions. Trust in public statements. Trust in investigations. Trust in the phrase, there is no evidence. Trust in official Because once people realize they have been misled before, they begin hearing everything differently. A denial becomes a delay tactic. A redaction becomes a clue. A sudden narrative shift becomes an alarm bell. And silence itself starts to sound suspicious. This is where conspiracy culture becomes powerful. Not because every theory is correct, but because real deception teaches people the emotional logic of hidden truth. And once that logic takes root, it spreads far beyond the original scandal. That is the paradox governments create when they hide too much. They do not only bury facts, they teach the public to doubt everything. 3. The thing no state wants to admit. Every government wants to appear rational, protective, legitimate, and morally controlled. No state wants to admit that its internal reality can include panic, manipulation, improvised lies, or strategic deception. But forbidden files keep forcing the same lesson back into history. Governments are not abstract machines. They are human systems. And human systems protect themselves. They miscalculate. They overreach. They lie under pressure. They justify after the fact. They hide embarrassment as if it were security. They defend their own continuity even when truth becomes the casualty. That doesn't make every state action evil, but it destroys the fantasy that power is automatically honest when it speaks formally. This is why forbidden file stories feel so dark, because they pull away the costume. They reveal that behind the seal, the podium, the intelligence memo, the classified stamp, there are still human motives. Fear, pride, ambition, career survival, geopolitics, reputation, leverage. And once you see that, official history becomes harder to consume passively. For the difference between a conspiracy and a system, one of the biggest mistakes people make with hidden history subjects is assuming every cover-up needs a dramatic conspiracy. A room full of villains, a mastermind, a perfect centralized plan. But many secrets do not survive because of a flawless conspiracy. They survive because the system naturally protects them. An official avoids risk. A department classifies a file. A journalist lacks proof. A witness is ignored. A memo is delayed. A superior says nothing. An agency refuses comment. Years pass. Nobody has to control every piece. The structure itself does the work. That may be the darkest lesson in this series. Because it means some events stay hidden, not because everyone is in on the lie, but because the machinery of power is already designed to reward silence. And that kind of concealment is far more durable than a dramatic plot. It doesn't depend on perfection. It depends on habit. 5. What forbidden files really reveal. At the surface, these stories seem to be about mysteries. Mind control programs, covert operations, redacted incidents, unexplained events, manipulated narratives. But underneath, they all reveal the same thing. Control over information is control over reality. If you control the timeline, you control outrage. If you control disclosure, you control memory. If you control the explanation, you control what future generations think happened. That is why hidden files matter so much, because they do not simply record history, they compete with it. Every forbidden file is a struggle between two worlds: what happened, and what people were told happened. And sometimes the distance between those two worlds is where trust goes to die. 6. The final question. After everything in this series, one question remains. What is being hidden right now? Not in theory, not in fiction, not in some distant era of Cold War paranoia. Now, what operation is being defended by silence? What mistake is being protected by classification? What event is being softened, delayed, or explained away while the file stays shut? We may never know most of the answers. That is the point. A hidden event is strongest while it is still unfolding. By the time the archive opens, the damage is often done. And that is what makes forbidden files more than historical curiosity. They are warnings. Warnings that secrecy does not only belong to the past. Warnings that power rarely becomes more transparent on its own. Warnings that official certainty should always be measured against the possibility of controlled ignorance. Because history has already shown the pattern. And patterns do not disappear just because people stop looking. Some files open, others wait. Some secrets eventually surface. A memo slips out. A witness talks. A program is exposed. A file is declassified. A lie ages badly and collapses under its own weight. But many truths do not arrive dramatically. They arrive late, fragmented, damaged, and always after the moment when they could have mattered most. That is why forbidden files haunt people, because they suggest history is not only what happened, but what was allowed to be known. And once you understand that, every official story carries a shadow, not proof of a lie, but the possibility of one. Some files open, others wait, and somewhere, even now, there may be events already moving toward the archive, already being renamed, managed, softened, or sealed, waiting for a future generation to discover what this one was never meant to see. Thanks for watching Forbidden Files, Events Government's Hid. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. And tell me in the comments which hidden case do you think governments still haven't fully revealed.